So, how many people today are either physically or emotionally exhausted? Yeah, just about all of us. Can you turn that meter down just a little? The first one on the left. I'm sorry, we got the mic fixed, but it takes a little while for me to get the volume just right. But, so, back to that. Okay, how many of us are emotionally, physically exhausted? Pretty much all of us, for the most part, right? Okay. Is there a week that goes by when there isn't something that does not trouble or stress us? Right? Or rather, maybe we should restate that. Is there a day that goes by when something does not trouble or stress us? We might be lucky if we get through an hour or two, right? But there's always something. Struggle, stress, suffering, however it is that we want to phrase it. It's unfortunately a normal part of life, isn't it? We encounter it every day, whether it be because of an illness in the family or ourselves, whether it be because of lack of work, conflict with a spouse, co-worker, friend. It might be a leaky sink or maybe a broken down car. The bills are piling up higher than the paychecks are. Children and their life choices. We just have to admit it. Life is hard, right? In fact, I believe we spend much of our time, if not most of our time, trying to avoid stress and complications. Life ceases to become about succeeding, and it starts to become about surviving and avoiding pitfalls. We begin to stop living life and to start running scared. But where does running scared get us? One of the first places that running scared gets us is away from God and the church, or at least it gets us running towards a very shallow, easy gospel, or what we call cheap grace. When we're running scared, we like to talk about the peace of God, but when we're running scared, we very seldom experience it. As it says in Romans 5, the peace that we desire is given by God through hope. And that hope comes through suffering. To run away denies all of these, and therefore even denies the peace that we so desperately need. But the gospel can be so hard, can't it? And on top of it, it looks like God is calling us to walk in a more stressful life, not a stress-free one. And so what happens is, when we come to Him with a life full of stress and troubles, we look at the gospel and we see all the stress and troubles that it's calling us into, and we go, that's not really what it's saying. Because this is going to make life more complicated, not easier. And so we begin to pick and choose what parts of it we want to be a part of, because we don't want the hard parts, because they make life harder, not easier. Think about what Jesus had to say. Do not resist the one who is evil. Turn the other cheek. If stolen from, give your cloak as well. Go the extra mile. Give to everyone who asks. Love your enemy. Pray for those who persecute you. Forgive 70 times 7. Lay up treasures in heaven. Sell all that you have. Become a servant to all. Think of everyone as better than yourself. Endure criticism and persecution. And it just continues. This doesn't sound like a stress-free life, does it? But that is the gospel, or at the very least, a very essential part of it. Then on top of that, Jesus has the nerve to say, don't worry, don't be anxious. God will take care of you. But all of our rational thinking says the very gospel that is supposed to bring me peace, if followed faithfully, is actually a recipe for anxiety and stress. And so when we are running scared from life, we in fact find ourselves running scared from the truth of the gospel as well. We see an example of this in the fledgling nation of Israel as they're going forward to enter the promised land. They send out spies in the land of Canaan, 12 of them, one from each tribe, for 40 days. God has sent the people to take the land. This will be their home, and now they must enter and take it. And so the spies return. And and they're actually very, very heavy laden. Do you know what they're carrying? They took a clump of grapes, and this clump of grapes was so large that it took 2 men to carry them. They brought back pomegranates, figs, and fruit. The land is flowing with milk and honey, but, especially if you've been following baseball nowadays, it is seemingly flowing with steroids, as there are MLB-sized warriors in the land, giants, and fortified cities. They say they are but ants compared to these Canaanites. But God is calling them in this direction anyway. This doesn't sound like the calling of the gospel, so to speak, is one towards peace and rest. But it sounds like it's one towards anxiety and stress and even death. What will they do? Turn over to Numbers chapter 14. Numbers chapter 14. I start in verse 1. Numbers chapter 14, starting in verse 1. Then all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. And all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Their rational, intelligent minds tell them this land is not flowing with milk and honey. This land is flowing with death and destruction, stress and anxiety. This is a recipe for disaster. And so they decide to run scared, to run away from the gospel, and essentially to run away from peace and rest. What were the Israelites trying to avoid? What were they trying to avoid by running away? You can go ahead and answer, it's okay. I'm sorry? Death. War, right? Stress, yeah. They didn't want to fight, they didn't want to suffer, and they didn't want to die. In the same way, we attempt to run away from the difficulty of the gospel because we are trying to avoid stress, anxiety, and suffering that we tell ourselves an honest faith would inevitably produce. But when we choose to run scared, what do we generally find along the way? Or rather, what did the Israelites find along the way? They found the very same thing they were trying to run away from in their attempt to run away from it. We find that the very thing we are running from, we are going to encounter anyway. Israel is looking to avoid battle and war. But if we were to look further on in Numbers, what do they end up finding? As they're running away from battle and war, they find battle and war. Look over to Numbers 20 and so on. We're not going to read it, but you can just look at it. Look at the headings. Edom refuses passage, and they bring a great army out to intimidate them. Well, no battle yet, but they're being intimidated, so they run again. The king of Arad, King Sihon and the Amorites, King Og of Bashan, they all wage war against Israel. Mind you, they're waging war against an Israel who's run away from the promise of God because they didn't want to go to war. Balak tries to curse them so that he can wage war against them. And then in chapter 31, they end up waging war against Balak anyway and defeating Midian. The truth of life is that it's not the gospel and the path that God has chosen for us that is a recipe for disaster, but rather it is life that is a recipe for disaster. This is something we cannot escape or run from. If we stay, we will encounter stress, troubles, and suffering. If we run, we will encounter stress, troubles, and suffering. So then what are we to do? supposed to be like Solomon and resign ourselves to life, saying life is meaningless? Is all going to fall apart anyway? Is life really a matter of choosing one hardship or the other? I mean, it seems like a lose-lose situation, doesn't it? If every decision in my life leads to suffering, then why make any decision at all? Why not at least take the selfish way that will give me a moment of pleasure? But all of that is only true if, when we look at the call of God, all we see is the stress and the struggle that we are being led into. If life is a struggle no matter what decision we make, then we need to realize that God is not calling us into hardship, because in reality the hardship is already there. God is not calling us into stress, anxiety, and difficulty, because it is already present in whatever direction we turn. Rather, what God is calling us to is not into the hardship, but a way through it. A way to experience peace and rest in the midst of the struggle. This is a truth of life that we oftentimes miss, that we are going to experience anyway. We are going to experience stress, anxiety, and trouble, whether we choose to follow God or not. The difference is, when God calls us, God gives us a way to make it through and succeed and experience peace and rest in the midst of the hardship, struggle, stress, and anxiety that we already were going to experience anyway. Think about Israel in this moment. Not in this moment of history, but in this moment in Numbers. Now they're fighting, waging war for what purpose? Why are they fighting? They're not fighting for the promised land. They're not fighting for the blessing. They're not fighting to gain a home. They're fighting for nothing. Just to survive. Because they chose to run away from the path God would have taken them through those hardships to find the blessing at the other end. So they're not fighting for peace and rest now. Because they chose to run scared, they are now fighting for nothing. Rather, in 40 years, their descendants will begin to fight for something. If we choose to run away from the difficulty of the gospel, to run away from what Christ has for us, we'll be fighting either way. There will be stress, anxiety, and hardship either way. But we'll be fighting for nothing. Let me give you something to illustrate visually. Hope maybe some of you have noticed my fishing pole over here. I just didn't bring a fishing pole for that. I want to show you something. Okay, if it'll work here. It's going to give me problems. There we go. Alright. Now, imagine, I know you can't see it because it's a dark green color, but imagine the fishing line as we sit here, being our lives, right? In our lives, we will experience tension, right? Something's going to pull on us every day, every way, every hour. Something is always pulling on us, isn't it? Okay. People get sick and die. Our bodies age and fail. My opinion never seems to be the same as yours. Children make foolish decisions. Money runs short. Things break. In other words, life happens every day, doesn't it? But notice that my fishing line is not just sitting here loose, is it? There are some things attached to it. Right? Okay. There is God attached to our lives. This is what He is calling Israel to, right? God bears the burden along with us. He bends, but we do not break. You see? He bends, but we don't break. Look at how much tension I'm putting on this. Here, we'll do two hands. Okay? With God, we are able to remain whole, to be at peace, to be sustained, even when the tension is pulling against us. With God, we are able to be at peace, to be sustained. When God is holding on to us, we will make it through. and we will not be left alone. But what happens when our life, this fishing line, experiences the tension without the rod, without God taking part of that? I am pulling pretty hard right now, okay? But notice something. Okay. The rod is going to take none of this. That didn't take much effort at all. I just snapped it in two. What happens when tension is put on our lives without the benefit of God bearing some, if not most, of the weight? That snapped pretty easily. When we run scared, we take all the weight off of God, and we attempt to bear it all ourselves. Turn with me over to Psalm chapter 27. Psalm chapter 27. Psalm chapter 27. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that I will seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock, and now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. And I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, seek my face. My heart says to you, your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me. Turn not your servant away in anger. O you who have been my help. Cast me not off, forsake me not, O God of my salvation. For my father and my mother have forsaken me, but the Lord will take me in. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me on a level path because of my enemies. Give me not up to the will of my adversaries, for false witness has risen against me, and they breathe out violence. I believe that I shall look upon the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Wait for the Lord. Be strong and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. There is one more truth of life that we should notice in reference to running scared. Every time we step away, we're not running towards safety, but we're running from it. Running scared makes life not simpler, but more difficult. It's like when someone begins to panic. As soon as that switch has been flipped, what happens? Well, nothing can be accomplished. Once panic has set in, it incrementally gets worse and out of control. Eventually, Israel got the hint. In 40 years after wandering in the desert, they weren't going to make the same mistake twice. But it wasn't going to be as simple this time. In Numbers chapter 1, a census was taken, and the fighting strength of Israel was 603,550 men. In Numbers 26, after 40 years, another census was taken, and the number diminished to 601,730. That doesn't seem like that big of a number, but let's look back and notice something. When Israel began in Egypt, there were only 70 men. They were there for over 400 years. That means that on average, for every 40-year period, Israel increased in its male fighting population by 60,000 every 40 years. And you have to imagine that the numbers were greater in the latter part of the 400 years, because 70 men are not going to create 60,000 fighting men in 40 years, are they? But 300 years later, there should be a whole lot more than that. So you have to figure that in the previous 40 years, so 40 years before Israel went into the wilderness, in that 40-year period, you have to imagine that their fighting force would have had to increase by at least 100,000. At least. So you go from one 40-year period of increasing your fighting force by 100,000 men to the next 40-year period decreasing your fighting force by 1,800 men. That's a big difference. That's a little bit more of a big deal, isn't it? When we run scared, which we must admit is our natural instinct, we actually make the danger greater. Running scared increases stress, increases anxiety, and increases suffering. God's calling on our lives is not about leading us into danger. Although that is where we'll many times end up going. It's about leading us through it. His calling is not about righteousness and holiness. While He does want us to be righteous and holy, His calling, more oftentimes than not, is about God guiding us through the troubles we are going to experience every single day. We need to realize that this is about survival, this is about blessing, this is about peace, this is about rest, this is about God wanting the best for His children. God instructs us to live in this manner not because He wishes us to be so-called good, but because God knows that it is the only way for us to flourish and experience peace. When we look at the struggle and anxiety or trouble in our lives, how many answers do we come up with? Well, normally we're much better at addressing problems than we are about fixing them, aren't we? Well, we need to realize when we look at those problems that are so easily coming to our lips to complain about, we may not have the answers, but God does. And the reason God calls us to act and live in a certain way is because when God looks at the valley of the shadow of death, He sees the path that leads right through the center and brings us safe out the other side, doesn't He? And we don't have the eyes to see that, do we? And that is why the gospel is hard. Why the gospel is difficult. Because God sees that running away from the valley of the shadow of death does not bring us any peace. But rather we must enter into it and walk through it, and walk through it in the manner and on the narrow path that He has shown us. The gospel is hard. It calls us to be a part of some very stressful and some very difficult situations. We cannot run from the difficult parts of the gospel just because we are stressed or we're busy. Instead, we need to see that the freedom from suffering and stress that we are seeking, they're actually found in the accomplishment of the gospel, in the hope of our Savior. There is value, and this is what we want to express. There is value in church community, church services, church gatherings, beyond simply preaching, learning, classes, and understanding. What is of better value? That you read the Scripture, don't understand a word from it, but go out and accomplish the gospel, or that you show up, read the Scripture, understand every word of it, and still somehow miss the point. There is a treasure in obedience that is more than simply being good. There is worth in turning the other cheek, giving beyond our means, exposing our weaknesses and failures, and leaning on the arms of God and community. There is more value to this congregation than simply the words being spoken right now. And in order for us to be able to see that importance, to see that peace and rest. We need to be able to gather together, to love one another, to share honestly and vulnerably with one another, to be able to go out of our way and bear each other's burdens. These are all hard things. But it's only when we encounter these things with God as our strength that we can make it through life without snapping like that fishing line.